In 2 prototype deals worth more than $1.3 billion, the U.S. Space Development Agency or SDA, said on Monday that it would launch 28 tiny satellites into low Earth orbit. The satellites are intended to deliver the initial missile warning, missile tracking capabilities of the Future National Defense Space Architecture, or NDSA, and are due for flight in 3 years. The NDSA is made up of a number of different parts, including 2 tiers of space-based platforms known as the transport layer and the tracking layer by the SDA. Essentially a communication layer or constellation, the transport layer will offer assured, resilient, low-latency military data and connection to the complete range of warfighter platforms worldwide. It is intended to be a constellation of between 300 and 500 satellites in low Earth orbit, LEO, at an altitude between 750 and 1,200 kilometers. With a full constellation, at least 2 satellites will be visible in 95% of Earth's locations at all times, and at least 1 satellite will be visible at 99% of Earth's locations. The tracking layer will give worldwide indicators of advanced missile threats, including hypersonic missile systems, as well as warning, tracking, and targeting information. This capacity includes algorithms, cutting-edge processing techniques, data fusion across sensors and orbital regimes, and tactical data products that may be sent to the right user. It also includes space-based sensing. L3Harris Technologies, Inc., of Melbourne, Florida, and Northrop Grumman Strategic Space Systems of Redondo Beach, California, received the Tranche 1 tracking layer contracts. The L3Harris contract is worth approximately $700 million, while the Northrop Grumman contract is worth approximately $617 million. 14 Wide Field of View (WFOV) overhead permanent infrared sensor satellites will be built by each contractor and included in what SDA refers to as Tranche 1 of the tracking layer of its intended massive early warning constellation. According to SDA Director Derek Tournier, the 28 satellites will be launched into low Earth orbit in 4 separate launches, each of 7 satellites, starting in April 2025. The primary purpose of this contract is so that we can provide a missile warning tracking capability for the advanced missile threats and deliver that as rapidly as possible, he said. According to him, each satellite will be positioned in a polar orbit, which will cause them to circle the Earth from north to south. However, they will be spread out over 4 separate planes, or regions, in the world. It will therefore require 4 launches to deliver them, according to Tournier. The U.S. Air Force's Grand Forks Air Force Base in North Dakota and the U.S. Army's Redstone Arsenal in Alabama are where the Tranche 1 tracking layer satellites will be launched from. The fact that these capabilities are soon to be available demonstrates how swiftly the American military changed its space-based missile defense and warning approach. General John Hyten, who is now retired and was in charge of U.S. Strategic Command at the time, stated just 4 years ago that the Pentagon's space-based sensing capabilities must be updated in order to address new threats. This was crucial for being able to follow objects after their initial boost phase when they were moving very high speeds in the upper atmosphere or even space. This tracking layer, which also supports mid-course following, would have to be robust and able to identify and follow hypersonic threats across their entire flight envelope. This most recent SDA award, for a portion of the NDSA Layered Array Satellite Warning and Tracking System, comes at a time when worries about the threat of hypersonic weapons are on the rise because they can avoid detection by radars and traditional U.S. satellite systems. The apparent nuclear capability of China's hypersonic glide vehicle, which enters space and travels in an orbital-like manner before making a run through the atmosphere toward its target, was brought to light during last year's test. Congress granted SDA $550 million in additional funding in fiscal year 2022 to speed up the deployment of the tracking layer, with the explicit directive to demonstrate a space-based missile warning, tracking, and targeting capability in support of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, the Pentagon said. This funding is a sign of how seriously the U.S. is taking the missile threat from China. But the idea is to make that program available everywhere. According to a Pentagon press release regarding the contract award made on Monday, the ambition for the NDSA includes fielding a system that offers a resilient worldwide capability to all combatant commands as quickly and economically as possible. According to Tournier, the contracts given to L3 Harris and Northrop Grumman are a portion of the Tranche 1 tracking program's $2.5 billion budget. That sum not only covers the cost of the satellites, but also the cost of the launches, as well as a $325 million contract that General Dynamics Mission Systems and Iridium were given in May to build the ground operations and integration section for the Tranche 1 tracking layer. The NDSA's ground entry points and operations centers will be constructed by these businesses, and they will also offer network operations and systems integration services for the SDA's upcoming batch of distributed low Earth orbit satellites. According to General Dynamics, the enterprise, network, mission, payload data, and constellation monitoring are the fundamental operations and integration tasks that span the ground, link, space, and user segments of the architecture. Using this vast, dispersed network of little satellites, it is hoped that the tracking layer would be more responsive, adaptable, and resilient to the increasingly likely threat of an enemy anti-satellite attack. It will be a continuation of the 8-satellite Tranche 0 tracking layer, which will launch 2 in September and another 6 in March of the following year, according to Tournier. He predicted that those will effectively show off the wide field of vision missile warning, missile tracking from space. The Space-Based Infrared System, SBIRS, Constellation, which you can read more about in depth here, is one of a very small number of larger satellites that the U.S. military currently uses for space-based early warning. In January 2020, SBIRS gave a noteworthy advance warning that Iranian ballistic missiles were en route toward bases hosting American troops in Iraq, allowing those people time to seek cover. SBIRS is also recognized for having sensors that are capable of detecting infrared events that are far smaller than the launch of a ballistic missile, such as the launch of smaller missiles, significant explosions, and even artillery fire. Hypersonic weapons, on the other hand, are much harder to track since they can move independently after the rocket element of the weapon burns up and travel at speeds greater than Mach 5. Furthermore, there are much more risks to satellites today than there were when legacy technologies like SBIRS were first introduced years ago. General David Thompson, the second in command of the U.S. Space Force, claimed last year that China and Russia are employing reversible attacks against American satellites every single day, including electronic warfare jamming, momentarily blinding lasers, and cyber attacks. He also said that a small Russian satellite designed to test an anti-satellite weapon on orbit in 2019 had first come dangerously close to an American satellite, raising fears of an actual attack. By building a constellation of hundreds of smaller satellites, the NDSA is intended to react to these new threats. This constellation will make it more difficult to blind the U.S. in space by dispersing the network's capabilities rather than focusing them on a small number of space-based assets. The loss of any units can be quickly compensated for by establishing a mesh network in which the constellation satellites interact with one another and with each other globally. Future U.S. satellite capabilities will increasingly be based around similarly dense constellations, instead of just a few orbital platforms, thanks to Starlink, which is already a favorite of the U.S. military. The environment in space has changed, Tournier said Monday. Previous systems were created in a fairly benign environment, that is, an environment that was not at all threatened. So you might plan your architecture based on a situation in which you didn't anticipate any threats to your satellites. These historical architectures were predicated on satellites that were $10 billion or more, would take 10 to 15 years to create, and they would operate for 15 or more years, as a result. But that's changing for two main reasons, according to Turner. The first is the threat to satellites, and the second is the danger posed by increasingly advanced missile systems harder to detect flight routes. Right now, space is a concern in our surroundings. As a result, we had to radically alter our approach to space architecture. According to Tournier, The architecture is now created to be more durable based on proliferation. To be able to carry out these kinds of missions, hundreds of satellites proliferating in low Earth orbit, flying, are required. A second pair of satellites will also be launched into medium Earth orbit, MEO, at a distance of between 10,000 and 20,000 kilometers in order to offer a more reliable backup for the missile warning, missile tracking. Therefore, LEO and MEO must both be eliminated if you want to eliminate both capabilities. Everyone launched with ballistic missiles, therefore I would have fixed a warhead to the top of a massive rocket. That rocket would get lit up by me. When it would emit a really brilliant flash, I could quickly determine its trajectory and, using physics, determine exactly where the missile would land. And it was effective for a very long time. Hypersonic warheads on missiles pose a problem because they not only launch on a rocket, but once they get up to those hypersonic speeds, Mach 5 and beyond, they may really start to maneuver, according to Tournier. As with a plane flying through the air, they can really use aeronautical forces, so they can use the forces of the atmosphere to navigate where they're going to land. These might constitute major movements. The missile will maneuver extensively, so if I watch where it's going and try to forecast where it's going based only on physics and the ballistic trajectory, I won't be able to guess where it's going to fall. Due to the fact that almost everything is designed around doing what we term missile warning, which is first launch, the United States currently has little capabilities to do that tracking aspect. However, that will change thanks to the satellites in the Tranche 1 tracking layer. As many missiles as could be launched against us may be fully warned of and tracked by the satellites that we will be building and deploying, according to Tournier. Accordingly, we will be able to detect it as it's maneuvering and changing its impact point and be able to send that down and be able to tell an interceptor exactly where that missile is headed, in addition to the traditional missile warning mission of detecting the launch and predicting the impact point. As you can see in the news, our adversaries, especially Russia and China, have been building and testing hypersonic glide vehicles, thus these new capabilities are vital, according to Tournier. As was already said, the Tranche 1 tracking layer satellites are made to work with the Tranche 1 transport layer satellite array. In order to lay the groundwork for the Tranche 1 transport layer, which will be a mesh network of 126 optically interconnected space vehicles, the SDA in February announced the awards of 3 prototype agreements worth roughly $1.8 billion. According to the Pentagon, this network will provide a resilient, low-latency, high-volume data transport communication system. The first of those will be prepared for launch in September 2024. To illustrate how the two layers will operate in tandem, from detection, all the way down to what information the warfighter gets, Tournier highlighted the example of last year's Chinese hypersonic missile launch. After separating from the booster rocket, the hypersonic glide vehicle starts to move as it heats up in the atmosphere. When it occurs, Tournier said, our tracking satellites can spot it instantly. The monitoring satellites will start calculating and updating a two-dimensional trace of the missile's course. The transport layer satellites will then transmit the information to a ground station, where they will fuse all of those two-dimensional tracks, from multiples of these tracking satellites, together, in hundreds of milliseconds, from the tracking satellites. And as a result, I can now create a three-dimensional track, which is crucial because it could be used to direct an interceptor to destroy that hypersonic maneuvering vehicle. But in addition to that interceptor, troops on the ground also require knowledge about the potential landing location for the hypersonic weapon. Despite having direct connectivity to the transport layer data sources, they don't have direct connectivity to all these tracking layer satellite data feeds. When multiple of these tracks from various satellites are combined into a three-dimensional or two-dimensional track at the transport layer, the data can be sent immediately down via Link 16, an existing tactical data link that is present on many of our DOD equipment. It can be found on certain portable radios as well, so that people may decide whether to take cover or whether to engage other radar or weapon systems in order to intercept the hypersonic maneuvering vehicle. The information can be delivered down directly into theater. There is still a long way to go before this system is completely functional. It will take a large number of satellites delivered over a long period of time. However, we are currently witnessing the initial steps toward that challenging objective. Hope you guys love the video. Don't forget to hit the like button and please do subscribe the channel and press the bell icon to all, so you can get the notification on each upload.